Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be using this wonderful photograph from Pixabay as inspiration to try and sort of show you how to go about painting light in a sort of loose and sort of semi-abstract way, a way that focuses on tonal values. And using very little drawing and a sort of minimal loose style, a very simple style of painting, wet in wet, to try and build up the sort of atmosphere and the values of light against dark to give us the light coming in through the windows of this deserted, dilapidated room, the walls and the door on the right. I'm using Millford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board and my board is an angle of about 45 degrees, and I'm going to be establishing the light and the atmosphere to start with wet in wet. So using my large Pro Art Ron Ranson Harkey brush, or use any large flat brush, I'm going to wet the paper thoroughly all over, but I'm not going to wet the window. I'm cutting around the window to make sure that the wet in wet process will resist that area, so I will keep that area lighter than the rest. This is raw sienna, so I'm pulling raw sienna from the window. You can see the direction of my brush strokes is already trying to establish sort of movement of light from the window. And then I'm bringing in some burnt sienna, working quickly, wet into wet. You can see the paint running down the page, but resisting that window area. I don't mind bringing a little bit of colour across there because there is some tone anyway, but I just don't want any dark. This is indigo and burnt umber, and starting to establish the shadows. The most important thing to realise if you're trying to paint light is you can't show the light without showing it against something dark to really throw the contrast out, especially in a sort of fairly dramatic picture or idea like this, where the light is just streaming into this old deserted house. So I'm trying to establish I suppose mid-tones at the moment, using dark colours and strong colours, allowing the paint to diffuse and soften and blend and sort of mix on the page, just encouraging that sort of variation of these simple colours to try and establish an underpainting that will work for this painting. So therefore keeping the area around the window as light as possible, but trying to make sure that reflected light from the window as it bounces around on the walls and the floor is still kind of created by having lighter areas. And I'm just quickly establishing my floor lines and the doorway on the right using the rounded corner of a plastic store card and just dragging it through the paint, and that exposes some paler areas of paper and just helps me to keep that perspective of the room more alive within the wash, if you see what I mean. The paper is nice and wet still, but spraying a misting spray over certain areas will get the paint to actually run down with gravity because it's at 45 degrees. So I can continue to build a bit more texture, a bit more tone, particularly around the edges on the right, and then a bit later on the left of the painting where I want it to be darker so that my light is thrown into sharp contrast against the darkness. So I'm quickly getting in these broad brush strokes using indigo and burnt umber, that's right, using those two colours and then pulling out a little bit of shape and perspective with the tissue and maybe increasing a few light beams, very softly wiping off. I'm not pressing hard here because I don't want to make a huge amount of difference to the wash. I want this wash to be very gentle, very subtle, but to really establish my lights and my darks ready to go in with the second layer a bit later on. I flicked some water onto the page to see if it gives me the right sort of texture that I want, and I like that texture, but I still think I need these walls to be a little bit more flowing, if you see what I mean. So I'm going to spray them again, and you can see the paint running down the page. I can then tip and tilt the board, turning it around, and get that flow of water to run sort of horizontally across my composition, if you see what I mean. And this flattens out the wall a bit more and gives me a better sort of base for my underpainting. I've now laid my board flat on the table, and I'm just tidying it up a bit. Watercolour always dries about 30% lighter, so it will lighten up. So I've got to make sure I get enough dark in this initial wash, flattening out, straightening the edge down which I'm going to have my dark wall. And then I'm going to just add a little bit more dark paint underneath the window. And then I think a little bit of darker paint below where the light is going to be streaming in directionally through the window. Then I'm going to go back to the last stage that I did before I decided I needed to add more paint, and flick with my fingers some water from the water jar across the walls. You can see there's little blossoms and blooms starting to happen. Now I'm going to leave it to dry completely and then come back as soon as it's bone dry and continue with the next phase of putting in these really dark walls. So I've left it for a few hours, it's completely dry, and I've stood it back up at an angle of 45 degrees on my board again. And now I want to work on getting the really dark shadow over that arched window. So I'm using my flat brush. Should probably be using a calligraphy brush to start with to get the right curve, but I think that's okay. And I'm following my pencil drawing that I put in at the beginning. The shadow is really strong above the arch, and that's such an important part of establishing the light in the picture. And I think you can already see, even though I haven't done very much of this dark, using this really strong dark, which is created from indigo, burnt umber and Paynes grey. I want to darken up this whole wall, but I do want there to be some variation in colour and texture on the walls. So I'll use different directions of brush strokes, but my important objective here is to keep a nice sharp edge where the dark wall butts up against the light coming in from the window. That to me is the most important thing. The sort of softness of the light coming in through the window will contrast so well against this sharp, hard edge of the stone wall and the dark. I'm painting wet onto a dry painting, so I can take my time establishing the edge, but then work quickly to get a good coverage over the whole of this wall. I'm not interested in keeping anything there light. The whole thing can be dark, but I don't want it to be boring and flat. I want to have some sort of some gradations and sort of slight changes in tone and hue, and then bring across and establish the dark underneath the window. But of course it's going to be a little bit lighter because there's reflected light from the window bouncing up against that wall there. And now I can continue to build up the floor and the central wall. I can add in some warmer light on the lower part of that wall below the window with the burnt sienna. That will diffuse wet into the paint, the dark paint, and soften it down a bit. But I can begin to show the different shades of light, or the different shades of the wall as they're affected by the harsh light that's coming straight from the window, the reflected light, and the light beams that are flooding into the room. I can also use hard edges for the edge of the doorway, so that the eye kind of can just see that that is a doorway, and there's light sort of flooding in probably through a similar window in the room beyond that doorway. And then using the flat brush and following the horizontal direction of the floor to keep it looking nice and flat, putting in some darker marks but leaving some of the underpainting showing through, which has got a sort of a subtle golden glow, and that will suggest hopefully the light that's coming in through the window. Back to our dark colour, and still using the 3/4 inch flat brush. The dark colour, of course, is Paynes grey, indigo and burnt umber. And following my pencil guide for this doorway, especially across the top, to make sure that I get that slight upward perspective line above the doorway, just that slight slant. I can block in this corner with this lovely dark colour, and then it has to become lighter and more diffused as it progresses across the painting towards the middle, where the light is now bouncing off those walls and entering the room from the window. So I have to make sure it's kept nice and soft here. I can soften off with a clean damp brush if I need to, or I could use a tissue to blot some out, but I have to be careful that I'm sort of balancing up the hard edges of the door frame with the softness of the way the light is diffusing and becoming less bright the further into the room it goes. So then just a bit more dark introduced into the floor area and a bit more glow as well. And then I can leave it to dry completely and come back and finish off the window. So these first two stages have been all about setting the scene and getting in the general large loose shapes. Now we need to finesse it a bit. So it's nice and dry, and I've mixed up some burnt sienna, and the first thing I'm going to do is paint the curve above the window frame. As this is just small amounts of fairly crisp detail, I'm going to be quite careful to refer to the photograph to make sure I can see the various shades and tones around the window, and try to sort of get a simplified version of that into my painting to coalesce this scene and just bring things together a bit more. So I'm going to add the sort of orangey yellowy glow to this part of the wall that I can see in the photograph. And then start to build up this stone feature above the window that I've got in shadow across the arch of the window, and then it becomes darker on the left side of this, and we get a sort of an equal curve or shape coming across some sort of an architectural feature in this really old ancient building. With my small calligraphy brush, I'm carefully following the lines that I drew in my line drawing, which is the shadow of the window struts. Keeping them nice and straight and fine. This is where I need to be careful. I made sure that they were positioned in the right place with my pencil lines, so I'm carefully just going over those now. And hopefully once I get the window in, this should really help to give us the effect of the light shadow reflecting on this part of the window, the alcove. So that's my shadows. Now to get the rest of the window frame in, and I'm starting off with burnt sienna, but then I'm going to move to Paynes grey and just start to introduce some slightly darker areas of shadow. So continuing to work on the way the light is bouncing off the walls, a bit of a glow on that curved alcove. And then carefully using the tips of the flat brush and this lovely dark colour and just grazing the paper with the tips of the flat brush, following my pencil lines to put in the window pane dividers. Making sure that I join them in the same place as my shadow, otherwise that wouldn't work visually. And as more detail goes in, I can see where I want things slightly darker or even slightly lighter. I've seen that sort of beam of light on the orangey part of the alcove is just a bit too, it's too sort of uniform and too dark. So I'm going to put some clean water over the bottom area of that and soften that down, because I want to just lighten that up. There's more light coming in through the window. So I'm going to remove some of this paint. So I'm wetting it with clean water and then dabbing it off carefully with a tissue to sort of soften that transition, so that I'm sort of got more of the light in the lower area, if you see what I mean. And then I can dab out a little bit similarly from that sort of yellow stained glass part of the window above. So I can get a few more darks in as well. That sort of edge needs to be a bit darker, and then needs to be a bit darker along the floor, so I can work on building up those sort of subtle touches. Just working on a few shadows, a few darks here and there to add a little bit more subtlety here and there. Maybe just a couple of darks in the window frame. And I think I'm just about done. So here it is now with the tape removed, and I'm just going to, now that I've seen it with the tape removed, I'm going to add a little dark edge just down against where the light is flooding in from the window. And I think I'm also going to just create an extra pane of glass in that top area, because that didn't look quite right. Now overall, I'm reasonably happy with this, and I hope it's shown you how in order to create the light you have to think a little bit more about the way the light bounces around inside the room and how to create those sort of soft diffusions and gradations in your watercolour washes to try and create that light effect. And also that it's vitally important to have really good darks in order for the light to show up even more. But also to have soft and hard edges to really add interest and excitement to your painting. I hope you found that useful. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.